own daughter and son-in-law left me to drown in a locked car at the bottom of a lake. The last thing I heard before the water swallowed everything was my wife screaming my name. And then, nothing. If you are listening to this right now, it means I survived. It means I crawled back from the bottom of that lake and I found out the truth, and the truth was so much worse than the water. My name is Howard Calloway. I am 68 years old. I spent 32 years as a forensic accountant for the federal government, which means I have spent my entire career following money. I know how people hide it, how they move it, how they lie about it with a straight face and a firm handshake. I thought I had seen every version of human greed there was to see. I was wrong. The one version I never prepared for was the version that called me Dad. I need to back up. I need to tell you about the kind of man I was before this happened, because I think it matters. I was not a perfect father. I worked too many hours when my daughter Nora was young. I missed her middle school plays, her first track meet, her junior prom. My wife, Margaret, covered for me more times than I deserved. She would tell Nora I got stuck on a case, which was true. But the truth does not always excuse the absence. I carried that guilt for years. So when Nora grew up and married a man named Boyd, and Boyd started struggling to keep his landscaping business afloat, I did what guilty fathers do. I wrote checks. I told myself I was being generous. Looking back, I was buying forgiveness I was never actually owed. Boyd was charming the way certain dogs are charming, all wagging tail and warm eyes until the moment something threatens their dinner. He shook my hand at the wedding and told me I was getting the best son-in-law in the state of Tennessee. I believed him. Margaret smiled beside me in her blue dress and squeezed my arm, and I thought, well, at least I got the end part right. At least my daughter found someone solid. That was 11 years ago. 8 weeks ago, Boyd called and said he had found a piece of property on Percy Priest Lake that he wanted to show me. A cabin, he said. Something that could become a family investment. A place where the grandkids could grow up spending summers. We did not have grandchildren yet, but Nora was expecting her first, and that word, grandkids, hit me somewhere soft. I told Margaret to pack a bag for the weekend. The drive out was beautiful. Early October, the trees were turning, and the whole hillside above the lake looked like it was on fire in the best possible way. Boyd drove because he said he knew the back roads. Nora sat in the passenger seat, quiet, which I noticed but did not think much about. She had always been a quiet car rider. Margaret held my hand in the back seat and told me she was glad we were doing this. I was glad too. The cabin was real. That is what I keep coming back to. They had actually rented a cabin, stocked the refrigerator, built a fire. They were committed to the performance. We had dinner that first night like a normal family. Grilled trout, cornbread, a bottle of Pinot Noir that I brought from home. Boyd told a long story about a bid he had won that was going to turn the business around. Nora laughed at the right moments. I poured another glass of wine and thought, this is good. This is what I worked for. The next morning, Boyd suggested we drive around the lake to look at the land from the waterside. There was a scenic overlook road that wound along the eastern shore, a two-lane county road that hugged the ridge about 40 feet above the water. I should tell you, I am not a man who fears heights. I spent years walking the upper floors of half-constructed federal buildings, checking financial records against physical assets. But something about that road made me uneasy. The guardrail was low and old. The shoulder was loose gravel that crumbled at the edge. I mentioned it. Boyd laughed and said I was a city worrier. I let it go. We stopped at a pull-off about halfway along the ridge. Boyd said the view from the edge was worth it, that you could see the whole South Basin from there. I got out of the car. Margaret got out beside me. The water below was dark and still, reflecting the tree line like a mirror. It was genuinely beautiful. I took my phone out to take a photograph. I never took that photograph. I felt two hands against my back, not a stumble, not someone reaching past me. Hands, flat-palmed, deliberate, pushing hard. I went forward. The gravel gave way instantly beneath my feet, and I was over the edge before my brain had finished processing what was happening. I heard Margaret's voice cut off mid-syllable. Then the air rushing cold, and then the water hit me like a sheet of concrete. I do not remember the impact clearly. I remember the cold. The lake in October is not just cold, it is a physical assault. Every muscle in my body contracted at once. I went under and the darkness was total. I kicked. My shoes were heavy. My jacket was pulling me down. I clawed upward, following the light, and my head broke the surface long enough for me to pull one breath before I saw the car. Our rental car, a silver Jeep Grand Cherokee, was rolling off the same ridge. It came over slowly, almost gracefully, and hit the water about 30 feet from me. The front end went under first. The back end followed. It took less than 40 seconds to disappear. Margaret was in that car. The thought detonated inside my chest like a charge. I screamed her name and water poured into my mouth. I went under again. I fought back up. I looked for her. The lake surface was smooth and silent, like nothing had happened at all. And then I saw Boyd's car still parked at the pull-off above the ridge, with Boyd standing at the guardrail looking down. He was not waving. He was not calling for help. He was standing absolutely still, watching the water where our car had gone under. Beside him, Nora. She was not crying. She was looking at her phone. A 32-year career in forensic accounting teaches you to recognize the moment when the numbers stop adding up. This was that moment. I went under the surface again and I made myself think rather than panic. I was wearing a fleece vest with a pocket zipper on the chest. Inside that vest pocket, sealed in a Ziploc bag from the night before, because I had learned years ago to waterproof my essentials in the field, was my phone. Government habit, Margaret always teased me about it. I got to the bag, ripped it open with my teeth while treading water, and I called 911. I told the dispatcher I was in Percy Priest Lake on the East Basin shore. I told her a car had gone in. I told her my wife was inside. Then I told her something that I am certain she had never heard before. I told her the people who put us in the water were standing on the ridge above me, and I needed police, not just fire and rescue. I made it to a shallow point along the shore, a rocky shelf about 100 yards south of the impact zone, and I dragged myself up onto it. My clothes weighed twice what they should. My hands were shaking so badly I could not stand up for the first few minutes. I lay flat on those rocks in the October cold, and I stared up at the tree line, and I prayed harder than I have prayed for anything in my life. They found Margaret. A dive team pulled her out 22 minutes after the car went under. She had made it to the back seat, I learned later, and a pocket of air had held long enough. She was hypothermic and unconscious, and she had a broken collarbone from where she had been thrown against the doorframe. But she was alive. When the paramedic told me that, sitting in the back of an ambulance wrapped in a foil blanket, I bent forward and put my face in my hands, and I stayed there for a long time. Boyd and Nora were still at the scene when the sheriff's deputies arrived. Boyd's story was already prepared. He said Margaret had accidentally knocked the gear shift into neutral while reaching for something in the front seat, and the car had rolled. He said it happened so fast. He said he was in shock. He said my father-in-law went in trying to stop it. He said he and Nora had been trying to call for help when the police arrived. The deputy taking the report was young, maybe 26, and Boyd had a gift for seeming like the most reasonable man in any room. By the time the ambulance left with Margaret, Boyd and Nora were positioned as concerned family members at the scene of a horrible accident. I watched that from the stretcher. I watched Boyd put his arm around my daughter and speak to the deputy in a low, calm voice, and I thought, he has practiced this. That kind of calm is not natural. That kind of calm is rehearsed. They kept me at Vanderbilt Medical Center for 2 nights, hypothermia and observation. Margaret was across the hall, sedated for the collarbone. Boyd and Nora visited once. Boyd brought flowers from the hospital gift shop, the kind that come wrapped in cellophane with a plastic stick in them. He sat beside my bed and held my hand and told me how grateful he was that we were both alive. I looked at his eyes while he talked. I had looked at the eyes of federal fraud defendants for 32 years. Boyd's eyes were doing math. I knew in that hospital room exactly what he was. I did not say a word. I needed to understand why before I could understand what to do. My son-in-law and I had one thing in common, as it turned out. We both kept our most important files hidden. I had spent the last 3 years quietly managing my estate through a private attorney named Bernard Walsh, who I had worked with during a tax evasion case in 2014, and who I trusted completely. What Boyd did not know, what even Nora did not know, was that 18 months ago I had restructured the entire estate after Boyd and Nora started asking pointed questions about the timeline of my retirement accounts. Margaret thought I was being paranoid. I told her I was being careful. A forensic accountant is always careful. 2 days after I came home from the hospital, while Margaret was still at the rehabilitation facility working on the collarbone, I called Bernard. I told him what had happened at the lake. I told him what I had seen from the water. I asked him to pull Boyd's financial records as aggressively as the law allowed. Bernard is not the kind of man who asks twice. He came back to me in 48 hours. The landscaping business had not turned a profit in 3 years. Boyd had taken out a second mortgage on their house in Brentwood without Nora's knowledge, using a forged signature on the title, which is a felony in Tennessee. He owed a private lender named through a shell company in Delaware, which is the kind of financial structure that only means one thing. In my experience, the lender does not go to civil court when they want their money back. The amount outstanding with compounded interest was close to $400,000, and Boyd's life insurance policy on me, the one he had taken out 18 months ago under a clause in an estate document I had signed during a Christmas visit when he told me it was a routine beneficiary update, that policy was worth $1.2 million. I sat at my kitchen table with Bernard's summary in front of me, and I thought about the hands on my back. $1.2 million. That was the number. That was, 32 years of my career? Margaret's 30 years of nursing? Our house paid off in full? Our retirement accounts? Our life together? That was what all of it condensed down to in Boyd's calculations. $1.2 million and a car rolling into a lake. Bernard wanted to go to the police immediately. I told him to wait. I told him what I needed first. I needed to know if Nora knew. That distinction mattered to me more than anything else at that point. It mattered in a way that is probably hard to explain unless you have a daughter, unless you have spent 30 years loving someone and wondering if you failed them. I needed to know if she was a victim or if she was a participant. I needed to look her in the eye. I invited Nora to lunch the following Thursday. Just the two of us, I told her. Dad wants to check in. She came, which told me something. She was nervous in the way people are when they know a conversation is coming that they are not ready for. She ordered a salad she did not eat. She kept her phone face down on the table. I asked her how she was sleeping. She said fine. I asked her if Boyd was under any unusual financial pressure lately. Her fork stopped moving. I watched her face. I had watched 1,000 faces across deposition tables. I knew the difference between someone processing a question and someone deciding how much of the truth to give. What I saw in Nora's face was not the calculation of a conspirator. It was the fracture of someone who had been carrying something too heavy for too long. Her eyes filled up. She pressed her hand flat against the tablecloth and looked at me with an expression that I had not seen since she was 8 years old and she had broken her mother's ceramic bird on the mantel by accident. She said, "Daddy, I did not know about the lake. I swear to God I did not know that was going to happen." I believed her, and I want to be clear about why I believed her. Not because she was my daughter, not because I wanted to believe her. I believed her because I have spent a career measuring the difference between the lies people tell to protect themselves and the truth that comes out of them when the weight becomes unbearable. What came out of Nora at that lunch table was the truth. But she had known other things. She had known about the debt. She had known about the insurance policy, the real one, not the routine beneficiary update Boyd had sold her. She had known that Boyd had been meeting with a man named Strickland, which was apparently the name attached to the Delaware shell company, and that Strickland had made threats that were not abstract. She had not known that Boyd had interpreted those threats as instructions to solve the problem by putting his in-laws in a lake. But she had known enough. She had known and she had looked away, and she had gotten in the car. I reached across the table and I held her hand. I did not say everything I was feeling. I am not sure I had words for all of it then. I just held her hand and I looked at her and I said, "I need you to trust me for the next 2 weeks. I need you to go home and act completely normal. Can you do that?" She nodded. She was crying by then, quietly the way she has always cried, like she was trying not to take up too much space. What I did over the following 14 days was the most deliberate work of my career, and I have had a long career. Bernard got me a copy of Boyd's private loan agreement through a contact at the Delaware Secretary of State's office. The loan was structured with a clause that essentially made Boyd personally liable for the lender's legal exposure if the debt went unpublished, meaning Strickland could claim Boyd owed him for losses incurred by keeping the arrangement quiet. It was a kind of clause that is designed to trap someone, not protect them. The interest rate was 31%. I have seen federal defendants with better terms. I had recorded every conversation I had with Boyd since the lake. Tennessee is a one-party consent state. Every phone call, every visit to the house while Margaret was still in rehab. Boyd liked to talk when he thought he was winning. He told me at one point that he thought the investigation into the car incident was going to be closed as an accident. He sounded relieved. He sounded comfortable. People always make the most important mistakes when they feel comfortable. 11 days after the lake, I got the piece of information that changed everything. Bernard had pulled medical records through channels that are technically gray but professionally accepted in estate litigation. Nora's OBGYN had filed an insurance claim 3 months earlier for a prenatal consultation. The pregnancy was confirmed at 14 weeks. The baby's due date was April. I ran the dates. I ran them twice. If the pregnancy was 14 weeks in mid-August, conception was in early May. Boyd had been in Portland, Oregon for 6 weeks beginning April 28th, an extended job bid for a commercial property project that he had told us about at Easter dinner. The math did not work. I called Bernard. I told him I needed a discrete paternity test arranged through a private lab, the kind that can work from secondary sources without the subject's knowledge. Bernard knew the right people. It took a week. When the results came back, I sat with them for a long time before I called anyone. The child Nora was carrying was not Boyd's. I will not tell you how I felt in that moment. Some things are between a man and whatever silence he finds himself in when the world proves larger and stranger than he imagined. I will only say that I thought of Margaret immediately. I thought of her in that rehabilitation facility working her shoulder back into mobility, doing the exercises the therapist gave her, being cheerful because being cheerful is what Margaret does when she is in pain. I thought about what she was going to have to carry, and then I made myself stop feeling and start thinking, because that is the only way through some situations. The next morning, I called Boyd and told him I wanted to meet. I told him Margaret and I had discussed updating the estate documents now that they were expecting a grandchild, and I wanted to walk through some figures with him. Just the two of us, I said. Father and son-in-law. I said it like that. He agreed immediately, which told me everything about his confidence level. He thought this was the moment the money started moving in his direction. We met at my home office. I had Bernard on standby by phone. I had a digital recorder running in my chest pocket. Boyd sat across from my desk the way people sit when they think they are about to receive good news. He had his hands on his knees. He was almost smiling. I put a folder on the desk. Inside was a single page, a printout of his private loan agreement. His smile stopped. I put a second page next to it, the insurance policy, the real one. He started to speak. I held up my hand. I put a third page next to that, the paternity results. The room went very quiet. Outside, a lawn service was working on my neighbor's yard and the mower hummed steadily in the distance, completely indifferent to what was happening inside my office. Boyd stared at the 3 pages on my desk. I watched the calculations running behind his eyes. He was trying to find the angle, the version of this conversation where he walked out ahead of where he had come in. That was who he was. He had never in his life sat in a room and simply accepted a consequence. There was always an angle. He said, "Howard, I can explain all of this." I said, "I know you believe that." I picked up my phone and called Bernard. Bernard had already, as of that morning, filed a formal fraud complaint with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation regarding the forged mortgage signature. He had flagged the insurance policy to the state insurance commissioner's office as a potentially fraudulent beneficiary instrument, and he had forwarded the complete loan documentation to the FBI field office in Nashville, which has a financial crimes division that I had worked with 4 times during my career, and which takes illegal lending structures with threats of physical harm extremely seriously. I told Boyd all of this while he sat across from my desk. I told him in the same voice I used for 32 years when I sat across from people who had believed their own cleverness a little too long. Then I told him what I wanted. I did not want him in prison. That is what surprises people when I tell this story. But prison was not what I was after. I was after something more permanent. Under Tennessee law, an individual who attempts to cause the death of another person for financial gain forfeits any and all claims against that person's estate. I had Bernard's filing ready. The moment Boyd was formally charged with attempted fraud and battery, which the TBI investigator I spoke with confirmed was a realistic charge given the evidence, he would be legally stripped of any beneficiary status in any document connected to my estate. The insurance policy would be voided. The mortgage fraud would put him in civil litigation that would consume whatever years of his life he did not spend defending the criminal charges. He would lose the business, the Brentwood house, the car, and whatever future he had imagined for himself sitting across from me in that chair. What I wanted in exchange for my cooperation in the investigation rather than private civil action, which would have taken years and cost both of us enormously, was a signed statement admitting to the forged mortgage document, a signed agreement releasing any and all claims against my estate in perpetuity, and a voluntary withdrawal from the marriage. I want to be careful how I say this next part. I did not ask Nora to end her marriage. That was not mine to ask, but I told Boyd clearly that his cooperation in the next 72 hours would determine whether the DA's office received my personal testimony about what I had seen from the water at Percy Priest Lake. If I testified about those hands on my back, and the testimony of a 32-year federal forensic accountant carries a specific weight in a Tennessee courtroom, the attempted homicide charge would be on the table. With the loan documentation showing financial motive and the forged mortgage showing prior criminal behavior, the DA would have enough to make that charge stick. Boyd signed everything within 48 hours. He was out of the house by the following Monday. He called me once afterward, which I found remarkable. He called to tell me that I had destroyed his life. I told him that I had simply showed him the full accounting of his own choices, which was a professional courtesy, and that I would not be accepting further calls. Then I hung up. Nora moved back into our house for a time. She needed it, and we needed to see her. There were difficult conversations, the kind that do not resolve neatly in a single afternoon, but stretch across weeks of ordinary dinners and long silences, and things said sideways when neither person is quite ready to say them directly. I am not going to tell you those conversations were easy. I am not going to tell you that a father who discovers his daughter looked away from evidence of real danger to her own parents does not feel something that takes a long time to name. He does. I did. But Nora was not the architect of what happened at that lake. She was someone who had married the wrong person and had been slowly taught to accept too much, which is a familiar story and one that does not make her a villain. It makes her someone who needed a way out that she could not build alone. The baby was born in April, a girl. They named her Ruth, which was Margaret's mother's name, and Margaret cried for 20 minutes when she found out. We were in the delivery room. I held Ruth about an hour after she was born, and she grabbed my finger with a grip that is genuinely startling for someone that small, and I thought, this is what I came back from the lake for. This grip. This specific small hand. Boyd pled guilty to the mortgage fraud charge 4 months after he left. He received 30 months probation and a civil judgment that will follow him for years. The attempted homicide charge was not filed. That was my call to make, and I made it. I will not second-guess it. The man who pushed me off that ridge, if he had the hands I believe he had, and I am certain he did, is living now in a way that contains its own punishment. Because he knows what he tried to do, and he knows that I know. And he knows that every person in his professional and personal life now has access to a public court record with his name on a fraud conviction. There are different kinds of consequences. I chose the kind that let me move forward rather than spend years in a courtroom. Margaret and I celebrated our 40th wedding anniversary last June on a houseboat we rented on Center Hill Lake. We brought Ruth. Nora sat on the back deck with a baby and watched the sun go down over the water, and did not say anything for a long time, and I sat beside her and did not say anything either, and it was the most peaceful I have felt in 2 years. I recorded this because I was asked by a few people who know what happened whether I had ever considered just staying quiet about it. Just absorbing it, moving on, keeping the family whole. And my answer is no. Not because I am a hard man, though I have been called that, but because the truth has a weight that does not go away just because you refuse to pick it up. It sits there. It presses on everyone around it. Children grow up in houses where truths are buried, and they learn without anyone telling them that certain things are not to be spoken, and that lesson damages them in ways that take decades to surface. I was not willing to do that to Ruth. I was not willing to do that to Nora. And I was not willing to do that to the man I have spent 68 years trying to be. You trust the people you love. That is not naivety. That is the correct way to live. But trust is not the same as blindness, and love is not the same as silence. If there is one thing a career built on following money has taught me, it is that the accounts always balance eventually. Every transaction leaves a record, and no matter how carefully someone believes they have covered their tracks, there is always a number that does not add up. You just have to know where to look. I am still looking. I always will be. I keep thinking about the moment I broke the surface of that lake. Not the fear, not the cold, the silence. The water was completely still around me, like nothing had happened. And up on the ridge, two people who had sat at my dinner table for 11 years were watching to see if anything moved below. That image does not leave you. It becomes the thing your mind returns to at 3 a.m. when the rest of the world is quiet. What I understand now, looking back at the whole shape of it, is that what happened at Percy Priest Lake was not something that began the day Boyd decided on a number. It began years earlier, in small choices. His choice to borrow money he could not repay and hide it. Nora's choice to look away from evidence she did not want to see. My own choice, if I am being honest with myself, to write checks instead of asking harder questions. Every large catastrophe is really just a collection of small surrenders that nobody stopped in time. The accounts were unbalanced long before anyone went near the water. I am not a man who believes consequences are delivered from somewhere above. I believe they accumulate. Boyd did not lose everything because the universe punished him. He lost everything because the structure he built was fraudulent at its foundation. And fraudulent structures always collapse. It might take a week or it might take a decade, but the math catches up. It always does. That is not philosophy. That is just what I spent 32 years watching happen to other people before it walked into my own house. What carried Margaret and me through those weeks after the lake was not rage, though there was plenty of that. It was something quieter. It was the discipline to think when everything in me wanted to react. It was a willingness to sit across from my own son-in-law and stay calm while I watched him calculate his next move, because I knew that calm was the only weapon I had that he did not know how to counter. A man who has spent his life following money knows that the person who controls their emotions in a negotiation controls the outcome. Boyd had emotion in surplus. I had patience. Patience won. And Nora. I want to say something honest about Nora, because she is the part of this story that people find most complicated. She was not innocent, but she was not the person who made that car go over the ridge. She was someone who had spent years being slowly taught that what she saw was not what was real, and that is a different kind of damage than malice. It takes a particular kind of strength to sit across from your father at a restaurant table and finally say the true thing out loud after years of silence. I do not minimize what she failed to do, but I also refuse to minimize what it took for her to do that eventually. Both things are true at the same time, and part of growing older is learning to hold two true things without needing them to resolve into one. Ruth was born in April. She grabbed my finger and I thought, there it is. That is the reason you stay clear-headed when everything tells you to fall apart. That is the reason you choose the harder path when the easier one is just giving up and calling it grief. The people who try to take everything from you are counting on you to act like someone who has lost everything. The moment you refuse that role, they have already lost. I am 68 years old, and I am still learning what it means to do the right thing when the right thing costs something real. I think that is the work of a whole life. I do not think it ends.